3 hours before the doors flew open, Salvatore had been almost calm. Almost. He sat at the head of the rosewood table with his hands flat on the surface, fingers spread. The way his father had taught him to sit when he wanted to look like he owned the ground beneath the building. The city glittered 40 floors below. All orange light and moving traffic, completely unaware that the deal being made above it would redraw the map of every block from Fifth Avenue to the waterfront. Mr. Kang sat opposite him in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people's cars. He had the kind of face that never quite smiled and never quite frowned, just stayed still and watchful, like a man who had learned long ago that expressions were a weakness. 2 of his men stood behind him. 2 of Salvatore's stood behind him. Carlo Rizzo, Salvatore's right hand, stood closest to the door with his arms folded and his jaw tight. The translator, a thin, nervous man named Bae, sat between them both, sweating quietly into his collar. The southern corridor, Kang said, his English clean and careful, must be included in the transfer. Without it, there is no deal. Salvatore didn't answer right away. He had learned that silence was its own kind of language. He let it sit in the room for a few seconds, heavy and deliberate, before he picked up the contract and turned to page 7. The southern corridor, he said slowly, runs through 3 of my oldest holdings. You're asking me to hand over ground my people have worked for 15 years. He set the paper down. That's not a transfer. That's a burial. Kang tilted his head slightly. Business requires sacrifice. Business requires respect, Salvatore said. There's a difference. The tension in the room tightened like a rope being pulled from both ends. Carlo shifted his weight near the door. One of Kang's bodyguards adjusted his sunglasses, even though the overhead lights were dim. Bae the translator looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Salvatore was about to speak again when he heard it, a small sound from the hallway. A quick, light sound, like beads knocking together. He thought nothing of it. Kang slid a revised page across the table. My legal team has already outlined the terms. They are generous, Mr. Mancini. More generous than your current position deserves. Salvatore looked at the page. The numbers were clean. The language was smooth. Something about it felt wrong in the way that a quiet street feels wrong. Not because of what you can see, but because of what you can't. He was still reading when the doors opened. Later, he would think about how nobody stopped her. There were 2 armed men in the hallway. There was a front desk on the lobby level, a private elevator that required a key card, and a waiting area where her mother had been sitting with her. The 2 of them tucked into a corner chair with a picture book between them. Aria Chikazi had apparently decided that none of that applied to her. She came through the doors at a purposeful walk, her light green dress swishing at her knees, her braids swinging with their small colored beads clicking against each other in the silence. She wasn't running. She wasn't crying. She looked like someone who had somewhere to be and had simply decided to go there. Carlo moved forward instantly. Hey, Salvatore raised one finger without looking at him. Carlo stopped. The girl reached the table. She was small enough that her chin barely cleared the edge, but she didn't seem to notice or care. She looked at the revised page that Kang had just slid across. She looked at it the way you look at something you already understand. Then she looked at Kang, and she spoke. The Korean came out steady and fast, each word sitting perfectly in its place. Not a child sounding out syllables. Not a phrase memorized from a lesson. Full, flowing sentences that landed in the room like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples across every face at the table. Kang's stillness finally broke, and Salvatore, who had not shown surprise in longer than he could remember, felt something shift quietly behind his ribs. He leaned forward. Let her finish, he said. Nobody moved. That was the thing Salvatore noticed first. In a room full of men who were paid specifically to move, to react, to protect, to respond, not one of them did anything. Carlos stood with his arms still folded, but his eyes had gone wide. The 2 bodyguards behind Kang had their hands at their sides like they had forgotten what hands were for. Bae the translator had his pen hovering above his notepad, frozen halfway through a word he would never finish writing. The only person in the room who seemed completely comfortable was the one who should have been the most afraid. Aria stood at the edge of the table with her small hand still resting on the wood, speaking in Korean with the kind of calm that made grown men look nervous by comparison. She wasn't performing. She wasn't showing off. She spoke the way people speak when they simply know what they are talking about and see no reason to pretend otherwise. Salvatore watched Kang. That was always where the truth lived, not in what people said, but in what their faces did when they thought no one was paying attention. And right now, Kang's face was doing something very interesting. The stillness was cracking. Beneath it, working its way up like heat through stone, was something sharp and rattled and barely controlled. Arya paused. She reached forward with 2 small fingers and tapped the revised page that Kang had slid across the table. She tapped it 3 times, precisely, on a paragraph near the bottom of the page. Then she looked up at Salvatore and switched to English without missing a single beat. That part, she said, pointing at the paragraph, says that after 1 year, everything goes to him. Not half. Everything. The room stayed silent. Salvatore's hand moved to his chest. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the gesture of a man performing shock for an audience. It was the automatic, private movement of someone whose body reacts before his mind catches up, a single palm pressing flat just below his collarbone, as if he needed to physically hold something in place. He looked at the paragraph. His Korean was strong enough to read it, but he had been deliberately keeping that fact hidden for the entire negotiation, watching Bae's translations carefully, measuring what was being left out. He had suspected dishonesty in the wording. He had not suspected anything this clean or this total. The clause was written in formal legal Korean, buried inside language about asset consolidation for mutual growth. In plain terms, it said that after 12 months of the so-called joint venture, full ownership of all transferred holdings would pass permanently to Kang's company. No exit, no appeal, no return. It was not a business deal. It was a slow trap with a 12-month fuse. Salvatore lowered his hand from his chest. He set it flat on the table again, very quietly, and looked at Kang with the kind of expression that contains absolutely nothing. No anger, no accusation, just a steady, level attention that was somehow worse than either. Kang's jaw tightened. Behind him, one of his bodyguards finally moved, a small shift of weight, a shoulder rolling back, and the movement seemed to wake the rest of the room up. Like a signal, Carlo uncrossed his arms. One of Salvatore's men exhaled. Bae the translator lowered his pen to the notepad and did not write a single thing. "She's a child," Kang said. His voice was smooth but slightly thinner than before. She wandered in from the hallway. "This is not appropriate." Salvatore didn't look at Kang when he responded. He was still reading the paragraph. "You're right," he said. "She's 6. He turned the page slowly toward himself and read the clause again from the beginning. "Which makes it interesting that she understood it better than the man I'm paying to translate." Bae made a small, miserable sound and looked at the table. Arya, for her part, had not moved. She stood at the edge of the rosewood table in her green dress, beads resting still against her braids now, watching Salvatore with wide, patient eyes. She looked like someone who had delivered a message and was simply waiting to see what the person would do with it. She did not look like she was in any hurry. Salvatore pulled the contract fully in front of him and turned to page 1. "We're starting over," he said. Starting over was not something Kang Dae-Hyun had planned for. Salvatore could see it in the small, controlled way the man straightened in his chair, the slight pull of his shoulders, the deliberate reset of his expression back to its usual stillness. Kang was a man who prepared everything in advance and left nothing to chance. He had prepared for Salvatore's anger. He had prepared for Salvatore's suspicion. He had prepared for lawyers, for counters, for walkouts. He had not prepared for a 6-year-old girl with colored beads in her braids and a working knowledge of formal legal Korean. Salvatore slid the contract to the center of the table and looked at Arya. "Show me," he said simply. From the beginning, Arya pulled herself up slightly on her toes to see better and leaned over the pages. She moved through them with a focus that made the room feel different, quieter, more serious, like the air itself was paying attention. She didn't rush. She found the first page, traced a line with her small finger, and began. She spoke in English for Salvatore, then turned her head toward Kang and repeated it in Korean. Back and forth, smooth and even, like 2 streams running parallel without either one disturbing the other. Her English was clear and simple. Her Korean was something else entirely, structured and precise. The kind that belonged in a courtroom or a university hall, not in the mouth of a first grader. "This first part," she said in English, "says it's a partnership. Both sides share." She turned to Kang and said it in Korean, her voice unhurried. Then she moved to the next marked section. "But this part says that Salvatore's company becomes a subsidiary. That means it goes underneath Mr. Kang's company. like a smaller box inside a bigger box. Carlo, standing near the door, made a low sound in his throat. Keep going, Salvatore said. She kept going. Page by page, clause by clause. Arya moved through the contract the way a small, serious surgeon moves through a procedure. Careful, certain, without drama. She explained that the phrase joint operational management actually meant Kang's team would hold all final decision-making power within 90 days. She explained that the mutual profit-sharing clause had a subsection, written in smaller print, that reduced Salvatore's share to 4% after the first year. She explained that the word used for venture in the Korean text was not the standard business term, but an older word that carried the meaning of something closer to absorption. Each time she finished a point in English, she turned and delivered it in Korean directly to Kang, without softening a single word. Kang's composure was holding, but it was holding the way old plaster holds, with visible effort and small cracks beginning to show at the edges. By the time Arya reached the clause she had pointed out before, the total asset transfer at the 12-month mark, the room had changed completely. The bodyguards were no longer frozen in confusion. They were frozen in the specific, uncomfortable way of men who understood that something had gone very wrong for the person they were protecting. Arya tapped the page again with 2 fingers. This part, she said in English, looking at Salvatore, is the real contract. Everything before it is just the wrapping paper. She paused. My mom wraps presents really nicely too. But the present inside isn't always what the paper makes you think. Something shifted in Salvatore's face. Not much. Just a small movement around his eyes, there and gone, like light passing briefly through a curtain. He looked at the page. Then he looked at Arya. And in Korean? He said quietly. What do they call it? The whole thing, not just this clause. What's the actual name for what this contract does? Arya turned to face Kang fully. She stood straight, beads still, dressed perfectly neat, and she spoke 4 words in Korean that landed in the room with the weight of something much larger than 4 words. Then she turned back to Salvatore and translated without any change in her expression. Total asset seizure, she said. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Salvatore had heard all evening. He closed the contract. He did not slam it. He simply closed it, slowly and completely, and pushed it across the table toward Kang. I think, Salvatore said, we're done with your version. Carlo Rizzo had the patience of a man who had grown up solving problems quickly and had never seen a reason to change that habit. He had been standing near the door for the better part of an hour, arms folded, jaw working slowly like he was chewing on something he hadn't decided whether to swallow. He had watched the girl walk in. He had watched her take over the table. He had watched his boss, the man who made entire city blocks go quiet when he walked through them, sit back and let a child in a green dress dismantle a contract that Carlo's own people had spent 3 weeks reviewing. And Carlo had said nothing. But Carlo's nothing had a temperature, and right now it was rising. He unfolded his arms and pushed off from the wall. Sal. His voice was low and flat, the tone he used when he was being careful about how much he let show. We need a minute. Just us. Salvatore didn't look up from the contract pages spread in front of him. We're busy. I can see that. Carlo moved 2 steps closer to the table, and his eyes went to Arya with the kind of look that wasn't cruel but wasn't gentle either, the look of a man sizing up an obstacle. The kid needs to go back to wherever she came from. We've got business. Arya looked at Carlo. She didn't step back. She just looked at him with those wide, patient eyes and then looked back at the contract, as if she had assessed the situation and decided it didn't require her full attention. Carlo reached out and put a hand on her shoulder. Light. Not rough, but deliberate. Come on, sweetheart. Somebody downstairs is looking for you. Carlo. The word came out of Salvatore like a door closing. 1 word, 1 syllable, and it stopped Carlo's hand where it was. Carlo looked at his boss. Salvatore had not raised his voice. He hadn't shifted his posture or changed his expression. But something in the quality of his stillness had altered. The way the air changes just before a storm arrives. Not loud, not dramatic, just different in a way that every instinct in your body registers before your mind does. Carlo slowly withdrew his hand from Arya's shoulder. She's a kid, Sal, he said, keeping his voice reasonable, the way you keep a flame low when you're not sure what's nearby. She doesn't belong in here. This is a serious, she stays. The 2 words hit the room cleanly and completely, leaving no space for negotiation. Salvatore finally looked up. He looked at Carlo the way he sometimes looked at contracts, reading what was actually there, not what was meant to appear there. Then he looked around the table. At Bay, who had not translated a single honest word all evening. At his own associates, who had reviewed 3 weeks of paperwork and missed every trap inside it. At Kang's side of the table, where the men in black suits had known exactly what the contract contained and had said nothing. He let the silence sit for one full moment. She stays, he said again, and this time his voice was quieter, which somehow made it heavier. She's the only one in here telling the truth. The words landed differently on different people. On Bay, they landed like a verdict. On Kang's bodyguards, they landed like an accusation. On Kang himself, they landed like something he would need to think about later, privately, in a room where no one could see his face. On Carlo, they landed like a correction from someone he respected, which was the one kind that actually reached him. His jaw tightened for a moment. Then he stepped back, unfolded his arms, and leaned against the wall again, but differently this time. Less like a man waiting to act, and more like a man reassessing what action was actually needed. Arya had not moved through any of it. She stood at the table with her fingers still resting lightly on the open page, waiting with the simple, steady patience of someone who had never doubted that she would be allowed to finish. She looked up at Salvatore. He gave her a small nod. "Keep going," he said. And she did. The contract was in pieces. Not literally. The pages were still whole, still stacked neatly on the rosewood table. But in every way that mattered. Kang's carefully built structure had been taken apart, clause by clause, and laid out flat for everyone in the room to see clearly. There was nothing left to hide behind. The wrapping paper, as Arya had called it, was gone. Kang sat very still on his side of the table. His composure had returned, or at least the surface of it had. The way ice reforms over water after you break it, thin, and not entirely trustworthy. Salvatore leaned back in his chair and looked at Arya. She had finished. She stood with both hands now resting on the table edge, her shoulders relaxed, her braids falling forward slightly. She looked tired in the small, honest way that children look tired, not defeated, just emptied out in the good way that comes after doing something that required everything you had. The room was quiet. Outside the tall windows, the city continued its business 40 floors below, completely unaware of what had just happened above it. "Hey," Salvatore said. Arya looked at him. His voice, when he spoke again, was different from the voice he used with Carlo or with Kang. It was lower, careful in a different way. Not the careful of a man controlling a room, but the careful of a man handling something he didn't want to damage. "Who taught you that?" he asked. "The Korean." Arya considered the question with the particular seriousness that children bring to questions they find genuinely interesting. "I learned from the lady next door," she said, "but mostly from my mom. She has books. A lot of books." She paused. "She says if you know how someone thinks in their own language, you can never really be tricked by them." Something moved through Salvatore's chest. Quiet and quick, like a current under still water. "What's your mom's name?" he asked. Arya looked at him with those wide eyes, and in them was the simple, open trust of a child who has not yet learned to be careful about answering that question. "Peace," she said. "Peace Chikazi." The name did not make Salvatore move. It did not make him speak. It did not do anything visible at all. But inside, quietly and completely, something that had been locked for a very long time came open. She had been 23 when he met her. He remembered that she was always reading, always had a book open somewhere nearby, on the kitchen counter, on the arm of the chair, face down on the bathroom sink. Korean literature, mostly. Philosophy sometimes. She had explained once, laughing softly at his expression, that she had fallen in love with the language at 14 through a borrowed drama series and had never found her way back out of it. He remembered that she never once tried to change him. She just lived alongside him with her books and her quiet certainty. And somehow that was more unsettling than any argument could have been, because it showed him, without a single word of criticism, what a different kind of life looked like. He remembered the last conversation. Standing in the doorway of her apartment, his jacket on, already becoming the version of himself that the street required. She had looked at him from across the room with an expression that was not angry and not broken. Just clear, the way her eyes always were, seeing him completely. "You don't have to be this," she had said. And he had left anyway. Because he had believed, with the total and terrible confidence of a young man who had survived by being hard. That softness was a thing you could not afford. That the part of himself that wanted what she was offering was a weakness he needed to cut away cleanly. Like you cut away anything that slows you down. He had been so certain. Salvatore looked at the child standing at his table. The beads in her braids. The green dress. The patient, unafraid eyes that looked, he now realized with a quiet shock, exactly like her mother's. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he asked very carefully, "Is she here? Your mom. Is she in the building?" Arya nodded. "She's downstairs," she said. "She's probably worried." "Yeah," Salvatore said softly. "She probably is." Kang Dae-Hyun had been quiet for too long. That was the thing about truly controlled people. Their silence wasn't empty. It was full. Full of calculation. Full of measurement. Full of the slow, careful work of a mind deciding which move still remained available. Salvatore had been watching him from the corner of his attention the whole time he was speaking with Arya. The way you watch a fire you think is contained, checking the edges, making sure nothing has caught without you noticing. Something had caught. It started small. A shift in how Kang was holding his pen, tighter, the knuckles slightly pale. Then the way his eyes moved between Arya and Salvatore and back again, quicker than before, losing the slow and deliberate rhythm of a man in control. Then the particular stillness of his mouth, pressed just slightly too flat, the expression of someone swallowing something that tasted bitter. Salvatore recognized all of it. He had worn all of it himself, at various points in his life, before he had learned to keep even those small signals from showing. Kang was losing his footing. And a man like Kang, who had built everything on the foundation of never losing his footing, did not handle that feeling well. Salvatore was about to speak, about to lay out the terms of a new conversation, one that started from honesty instead of dressed-up theft, when Kang set his pen down on the table. The small click of it against the wood was the only warning. Kang looked at Arya, and he spoke in Korean. It was quiet. It was almost polished in the way it was delivered, the tone smooth, and even the way certain insults are most effective precisely because they are not shouted. He used the kind of language that does not appear in textbooks, the kind that lives in the corners of a culture, passed between people who wish to wound without leaving visible marks. It was directed at Arya's heritage, at the mixture of where she came from, at the idea of her mother. And it was wrapped so neatly in formal language that anyone who didn't know Korean well would have heard only a composed businessman making a calm remark. But language, as Peace Chikazi had once told a young girl with a borrowed book, always means exactly what it means. Arya went very still. Not the stillness of fear. Not the stillness of a child who has been hurt and is trying not to show it. It was a different kind of stillness. The kind that comes when something lands and the body needs one honest moment to absorb it before deciding what to do next. Her small hands, resting on the table edge, pressed down slightly. Her eyes stayed on Kang's face. And then the room went quiet in a way it had not gone quiet all evening. It was a different quality of silence from before. Earlier, the room had gone quiet from surprise. The sudden, open silence of people who don't know what they are seeing. This silence was closed. Dense. It pressed against the walls and sat on the shoulders of every person present like something with actual weight. Carlo had straightened away from the wall. He didn't know Korean, but he knew the specific stillness that had settled over Salvatore's face. And that stillness told him everything he needed to know about the nature of what had just been said. Salvatore's hands were flat on the table. Both of them, perfectly still. His eyes were on Kang with an expression that had moved beyond anger into something quieter and considerably more dangerous. The expression of a man who has just been handed a very clear and final piece of information about who he is dealing with. Kang seemed to realize, a half-second too late, that he had miscalculated. He had believed, as he had believed from the beginning, that he was the only educated man in the room, that the language was his private territory, that he could say what he wished inside it and remain untouchable. He had forgotten, or never known, that the man across the table had once loved a woman who believed that language was the most powerful thing in the world, and had spent years proving her right. Salvatore looked at Arya. Her eyes were still bright, still steady, but at the very corners of them, just barely, something was pulling. "Hey," he said quietly. Just to her. "Look at me." She did. "He doesn't get to do that," Salvatore said. "Not in this room." Salvatore stood up. He did it slowly. The way he did most things when it mattered. Without rush, without performance, just a clean and deliberate unfolding from the chair that somehow made the room feel smaller. He was not a tall man in the way that announces itself. He was tall in the way that becomes apparent gradually. The way a room's ceiling becomes apparent only when something forces you to look up. He buttoned nothing, adjusted nothing. He stood in his white t-shirt with his tattooed arms at his sides, and he looked across the rosewood table at Kang Dae-Hyun with the full, undivided attention of a man who has just decided that the time for patience is completely over. And then he spoke Korean. Not the careful, measured Korean of someone working through a second language. Not the slow, deliberate speech of someone translating their thoughts on the way out. He spoke the way Arya spoke it, from somewhere inside, from a place where the language lived rather than visited. Fluid and exact, each word landing where it was meant to land. The sentences long and structured in the formal register that Kang himself had been using all evening. The effect on the room was immediate and total. Bae the translator made a small sound and put his pen down entirely. Carlo's head turned slowly toward Salvatore with an expression that was equal parts disbelief and something very close to admiration. Kang's bodyguards exchanged a single, quick glance, the glance of men whose entire understanding of a situation has just been revised without warning. Kang himself went completely still. Salvatore was not shouting. He was not threatening. He was doing something more effective than either. He was speaking to Kang in the formal language of Korean business culture. The deep and structured courtesy that carries inside it, for those who know how to read it, the full weight of what is not being said directly. He was telling Kang, in the precise vocabulary that Kang had used his whole career to establish his superiority, exactly what had happened in this room tonight. He said that Kang had entered a negotiation with hidden terms. He said that in the framework of the culture whose language Kang had chosen to conduct his deception in, this was not merely bad business. It was a specific and serious violation, a breach of the code that placed honesty in negotiation above the outcome of the negotiation itself. He used the word chamun, face, reputation, the thing a man of standing was supposed to protect not just for himself, but for the space he conducted business in. He said that Kang had not simply tried to steal. He had tried to steal while wearing the clothes of an honorable man, and in doing so, he had committed the worst offense of the two. He said all of it calmly, precisely, without a single word of anger, which made it devastating. Kang's composure had not just cracked now. It had become something different entirely, the rigid, overworked stillness of a man holding himself together through pure will, aware that the room has shifted completely beneath him, and that there is no position left that doesn't cost him something significant. Salvatore paused. He let the silence do its work for a moment. Then he continued, and his voice dropped slightly, becoming quieter and therefore more final. He said that he had learned this language for someone who had believed that knowing how a person thought in their own tongue was the only real protection against being deceived by them. He said she had been right. He said he had spent years understanding not just the words, but the values that lived underneath them. The ones that men like Kang wore publicly, and then set aside in private when they believed no one was watching. He said that tonight, someone had been watching. Then he looked at Arya, who was standing very straight beside the table, her eyes wide and luminous. And he said one final sentence in Korean that was directed not at Kang but at her, for quiet words that made Kang close his eyes briefly. The way you close your eyes when something you cannot argue with has been said about you in front of witnesses. Carlo leaned toward the associate beside him and spoke from the corner of his mouth. What did he just say? The associate shook his head slowly. I have no idea. But Kang looks like he wants to disappear. Salvatore sat back down. Now he said in English, we discussed new terms. Salvatore picked up the contract. He didn't make a speech about it. He didn't hold it up or look around the room to make sure everyone was watching. He simply lifted the stack of papers from the table, aligned the edges once against the wood with a clean, quiet tap, and tore it in half. Then he tore those halves in half again. He set the pieces down in a neat pile at the center of the table, directly in front of Kang. The way you leave something at a person's door that belongs to them and that you are finished with. Then he reached into the inside pocket of Carlo's jacket. Carlo blinked but didn't move and produced a fresh legal pad and a pen. New terms, he said. We start from zero. Kang looked at the torn pieces of his contract. A muscle moved in his jaw. He was a man who had walked into this room holding every advantage. The language, the legal structure, the prepared documentation, the translator he had quietly ensured would stay cooperative. He had walked in holding the entire board. In the space of one evening, a child in a green dress had taken it from him piece by piece and laid each piece flat on the table for everyone to see. "You have no grounds," Kang said. His voice was controlled, but thinner than it had been. "A verbal renegotiation in these circumstances carries no legal. Write it down, and it carries weight," Salvatore said. "That's why we have the pad." He uncapped the pen and looked at Arya. "Come here," he said. She came around the edge of the table and stood beside his chair. He angled the legal pad so she could see it clearly. "I'm going to talk," he told her. "You're going to tell me if anything I say doesn't match what it should mean. In either language. Can you do that?" Arya looked at the blank page. Then she looked at Kang. Then she looked back at Salvatore with the expression of someone who has been asked if they can do the thing they were born to do. "Yes," she said. Carlo made a sound that might have been a laugh in different circumstances. He turned it into a cough and looked at the ceiling. Salvatore began to dictate. The new terms were not complicated. That was the first thing that separated them from Kang's version. They didn't need to be complicated because they weren't hiding anything. The Southern Corridor would remain under its current management structure with a shared oversight committee, membership equal on both sides. Profit sharing would be fixed and transparent, reviewed every 6 months, with documentation available to both parties at any time without prior request. There would be no subsidiary clauses, no asset transfer conditions, no buried language about ownership migration. Any future amendments required agreement in writing from both sides in both languages, with independent translation verified by a third party. After each point, Salvatore paused and looked at Arya. She listened. She considered. Twice she asked him to reword something. Once because a phrase he used had a second meaning in Korean that he hadn't intended. And once because a term he borrowed from Kang's original document carried the same weight as language she had already flagged. Both times, Salvatore crossed out what he had written and rewrote it without argument. Kang watched this process with the expression of a man attending his own very organized and unhurried defeat. His bodyguards had settled into a different kind of stillness now. Not the frozen stillness of shock, but the quiet, resigned stillness of men who understood that the evening had concluded in a direction they could not reverse. When the new terms were complete, Salvatore read them back once from the beginning. Arya followed along on the page, her lips moving slightly, translating quietly to herself in both directions, checking each line the way a careful reader checks a map before a long journey. "Good?" Salvatore asked. "Good," she said. He turned the legal pad toward Kang and set the pen on top of it. Kang looked at the page for a long moment. He looked at Salvatore. He looked, briefly and with an expression he could not fully control, at Arya. Then he picked up the pen. When the signature was done, Salvatore looked down at Arya beside his chair. "Good work," he said quietly. Arya straightened her dress with both hands, very businesslike. "You spelled acquisition wrong on line 4, she said. "But I didn't want to say anything in front of everyone." Carlo laughed. This time he didn't bother hiding it. The meeting was technically still in session. There were follow-up points to cover. There were copies to be made of the new terms, associates to brief, calls to put in motion before the night got any older. Carlo had already pulled out his phone and was moving toward the window, his voice low and efficient, beginning the long process of converting what had happened in this room into the language of logistics and next steps. Kang was preparing to leave with the particular careful dignity of a man who intends to pretend, from this point forward, that the evening had gone differently than it had. None of it, Salvatore decided, required him right now. He pushed back from the table and stood. He looked at Arya, who had returned to standing quietly at the table's edge. Her job complete, her small hands folded in front of her with a patience that seemed almost old for her size. "Come on," he said. "I'll take you down." Carlo looked up from his phone. "Sal, we still need to handle it," Salvatore said. Not unkindly. Just finally. Carlo held his gaze for a moment, then nodded once and went back to his call. Salvatore and Arya walked out of the boardroom together. The two men in the hallway, who had apparently failed to notice a 6-year-old girl walk past them earlier in the evening, stood very straight as their boss came through the doors and said absolutely nothing to either of them. Arya glanced up at them with mild interest as she passed. The way you glance at a painting you have seen before and found unremarkable. They rode the elevator down in a comfortable quiet. Arya stood beside him and watched the floor numbers descend on the small panel above the doors. At the 31st floor, she said, without looking up. "You spoke Korean really well." "Thank you," Salvatore said. "My mom says most people give up on hard things too early." "Your mom is right." Arya seemed to consider this. "She's right about most things," she said, with the calm certainty of someone reporting a well-established fact. Salvatore looked down at her. The beads in her braids were slightly out of order from the evening, a few knocked sideways, one pink bead sitting where a white one had probably started. She still had the focused, settled look of a person who had done what they came to do and was at peace with how it had gone. He thought about the last time he had felt that way. At peace with how something had gone. He had to go back a long way to find it, and when he found it, it was standing in a small apartment with books on every surface, and a woman laughing softly at his expression because he hadn't understood why anyone would learn a language just for the love of it. He understood now. The elevator opened onto the lobby. She was sitting exactly where Arya had described, in the corner, in one of the low chairs near the window, a book open in her lap that she was no longer reading. She was watching the elevator doors with the expression of a mother who has been trying very hard to remain calm for longer than calm comes naturally. Peace Chikazi looked up. For a moment nobody moved. The lobby continued around them, the soft sound of the ventilation system, the distant click of heels on marble somewhere near the entrance, the low hum of a city that never fully rested. Then Arya walked across the lobby and tucked herself against her mother's side, and Peace's arm came around her automatically. The way breathing is automatic, the way certain things the body does simply because it cannot imagine not doing them. Peace looked at Salvatore over the top of her daughter's head. He looked back at her. There was too much between them for the lobby of a building to contain. Too much time, too many choices, too many doors walked through and closed behind. He knew that. He wasn't foolish enough to think that one evening rearranged any of it. But she was looking at him the way she had always looked at him. Clearly. Completely. Without the performance of either anger or forgiveness, just the plain and steady sight of a woman who saw people as they actually were. She was incredible, he said. Up there. You should know that. Peace looked down at Arya, then back up at him. I know, she said softly. I taught her. A small sound came out of Salvatore that surprised him. Not quite a laugh. Something quieter and less practiced. Something that belonged to a version of himself he had spent years trying to bury under contracts and territory and the daily serious business of being feared. He looked down at his white t-shirt, at the tattoos on his arms, at the hands that had torn up a contract tonight, instead of using them the way he more usually did. His soul, he thought, was going to need some time, some patience, some of the same steady, unhurried work that Peace had always believed anything worth having required. But for the first time in a very long time, he thought it might actually still be there. Waiting, the way certain things wait, not gone, just set aside. Like a book left face down on a bathroom sink, holding the place where you stopped, ready for whenever you were finally ready to come back and keep reading. Can I? He started, then stopped. Tried again. Would it be all right if I? Salvatore, Peace said quietly. He stopped. She closed her book, tucked it under her arm, and stood up. She looked at him for one long, clear moment. Then she said simply, walk us to the door. It was such a small thing. It was the whole world. He walked them to the door.